Okay, so it's Tuesday. We celebrated Simchat Torah. We concluded the reading of the book, the last parsha of the book of Devarim of Zos HaBracha, and the Jewish tradition is that we don't wait. Once we finish, we start again right away. So on Simchat Torah, on the holiday of Simchat Torah, we concluded the final chapters of Deuteronomy, of Devarim, and we right away began with the first chapter of Genesis, of Bereishis, which we read in the shul on Simchat Torah. So the week started midweek, so to speak. Usually we have a whole week to study a parsha. This week we only have a few days. And this Shabbos, we're going to read Parshas Bereishis, the first parsha, starting the new cycle of the Torah reading, which will go for the coming year. So it's a great beginning. It's a great time to excited to restart our cycle of study, Torah study. God willing, we plan on continuing again this year, Thursday nights for the most part. Sometimes we interchange a day or two if the scheduling conflicts come up. It's a good opportunity if you have any friends or neighbors or colleagues, family members that you think might be able to benefit from some Torah study on Zoom, from the comforts of your living room. Now would be a great time to get in touch with them and have them try it out. We'd love to expand the circle of learning. Really appreciate, this is one of the great things that came about from COVID with all the negatives, this study group that we've now been doing for 2.5 years. And we look forward to continuing for another strong year as we start off our studies. Okay, so Parsha Bereishis, the opening of the book of Genesis, the book of Bereishis, obviously begins with the story of creation. God creates the world in 6 days, rests on the seventh. That's how the Torah begins, describing what takes place, what he creates each day of creation. First day, God makes darkness and light. The second day, he forms the heavens, dividing the upper waters from the lower waters. The third day, he sets the boundaries of land and sea, calls forth trees and greenery from the earth. The fourth day, he fixed the position of the sun, the moon, the stars, the luminaries. The fifth day, fish, birds, and reptiles are created. And then on the sixth day of creation, land animals. And then finally, the last creation which happens on the sixth day, is the creation of the human being, Adam. And then the Torah says God ceased to work on the seventh day. He sanctifies the seventh day as the Shabbos, as the day of rest. And then in the continuation of the parsha, he goes into more detail discussing the events of the sixth day of creation, talking about how after Adam was formed from the earth, God placed him in the garden just east of Eden. God permits Adam to eat from any tree in the garden, with the exception of the tree of knowledge. Adam then names all the animals and birds, and God decides that Adam needs a mate. It's not good to live alone. So Adam falls into a deep slumber, and God forms a woman, Eve, Chava, from one of his sides. Adam was delighted with his new mate. Then we get introduced to the serpent, the wisest of all animals at the time, sweet talks Eve into eating from the fruit of the forbidden tree of knowledge. Eve shares the fruit with Adam. Now they're imbued with a new sense of knowledge and awareness. They're ashamed of their nakedness. They clothe themselves. And then the fallout comes where God curses the serpent. Eve and Adam are also cursed with various different punishments that they're given, and they're expelled from the Garden of Eden. Eve gives birth to 2 sons, Cain and Abel. Abel offers an offering to God. God accepts the offering. Cain also follows suit, but his offering is rejected. Cain is jealous of his brother. He murders his brother in a jealous rage. God punishes Cain. He designates him as a lifelong wanderer, but he postpones the ultimate punishment for 7 generations thereafter. And then towards the end of the parsha, we follow through generation after generation, talks about all the different generations, and the parsha concludes where we get to the 10th generation from Adam. This is when Noach comes about, and the Torah describes how the wickedness, the immorality of the people on earth reaches such a proportion that God regrets his whole entire creation. He regrets creating man, and he gave the world 120 years to clean up their act or be destroyed, and that destruction happens with the flood, which we read about next week. So that's a very brief summary of this really jam-packed Torah portion that we just really have this week, just a few days to study, and obviously we'll try to focus on one section of this parsha. So, they tell the story about these two guys are in a bar watching the 11 o'clock news, and they see on the screen they're showing footage. This man is threatening to jump off a bridge, and the first guy bets the second guy $50. He says, "I bet he's going to jump." The second guy says, "Okay, I'll take the bet. I'll say he won't jump." And the second guy gets ready to pay. He says, "Okay, I'll put down the $50." And then all of a sudden, a few seconds later, the man jumps. So the second guy is ready to pay up he lost the bet. The first guy says, "You know what, to tell you the truth, I already saw the 7 o'clock news and I already knew he jumped. So it wasn't really a fair bet. I'll let you slide." The second guy says, "I also saw the 7 o'clock news." He says, "What are you doing?" He says, "I thought after, the guy learned his lesson, then next time around, he's not going to jump." The point of the story is, we read the story of Adam and Eve last year, and the year before, and the year before, and we go through these, classical stories, and the question arises, or what we have to think about for a couple of minutes is, to what purpose, right? Why are we focusing on the stories? And to the extent that the Torah begins with the stories, not with the mitzvahs. He doesn't begin with the commandments. If we think about Torah as a book of instruction, an instruction guide, telling us how to live life, we would think that the Torah would begin with what its purpose is, telling us what we can do and what we can't do. There are 613 mitzvahs related in the Torah. Rashi actually asks this question in his very first commentary, and he says the Torah should have began with HaChodesh HaZelechem, the first commandment given to the Jewish people as a people when they were about to leave Egypt, to sanctify the new moon. There were individual commandments given to Abraham or given to our forefathers as an individual instruction, but as a community, as a Jewish people, as we're about to be formed as a people, it's only in the book of Exodus, the third parsha, Parshas Bay, where we get our first commandment. So Rashi goes off on a tangent and talks about how this is about the ownership of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. We discussed that topic at length, I believe, last year in last year's class on Bereishis. So we'll leave that to the side for tonight. But really what this gets to is to the core of what Torah study is about. Right? What is the purpose? What is the impact that Torah study is meant to have on us? And it's an interesting thing. If you think about how we view religion's impact on our life, right? There's many influences in the world. We're influenced by culture. We're influenced by academic pursuit. And religion is one of the big influencers of people's lives, regardless which religion. Right? So you can look at the Bible, definitely has its measure of influence. But the question is how we view that influence. Right? In other words, the Torah, the one view can be is that the Torah is coming from the outside to influence my life, to tell me what to do and what not to do. To tell me how to live my life, to take away perhaps my freedoms. I would like to do A, B, and C, but God says, you know what? That's no good. Don't eat this and don't work on this day or you should do A, B, and C. It's meant to influence our life. But really, it goes a lot deeper than that. And that's where we see how the Torah begins. But I'll introduce, there's a very foundational medrash that the medrash talks about what Torah is. Let me share a quote from a medrash. I just put it down here on a on the board here. Hold on one second. Here's the medrash. It says, God looked into the Torah and created his world. As the king looks into his blueprints and builds his palace, so God looked into the Torah and created his world. In other words, ultimately, the Torah is the blueprint for creation. So on one hand, we can look and say, you know what? I'm willing to accept the existence of God. God's the creator. I believe in a beginning from God, right? But how do I view God telling me what I should do or shouldn't do? In other words, to say that there's a God who is here, who has a divine plan, and I have to follow that plan, that's being sort of pushed on me from the outside. And what the Medrash is telling us, is giving us a foundation here, is that the truth is the Torah is not telling us trying to influence from the outside. The Torah is actually, the world is the vision that is created and brought into being through Torah. And that changes fundamentally how we view things. So what the Medrash tells us, that our existence, the way God made us, and what he used to make us, all of that comes from the Torah. So the very essence of our being is guided by the Torah. So it's not something from the outside telling us what it's to do. This is who we are. If you want to find alignment in your life, we need to look to Torah. But I want to just take this a step deeper, because I think this is a very fundamental idea. On one hand, you can say, let's say a carpenter, okay? A carpenter builds a nice, beautiful table, and he has a blueprint through which he uses to fashion his table. So you can say, fine, the carpenter has his blueprint, and his blueprint guides him to create this table, and this is what he designed it for this type of use, and for this type of room, and for this type of a usage that should be on it. But then I can come and I can say, you know what? The carpenter had his vision for the table, and I have my vision for the table. And I want to chop the table in half, and I want to use it as a stool. Or I want to use it as 3 tables. The truth is that the carpenter who builds a table is not creating anything new. He's changing the form of a substance that already exists. So even the form that the carpenter gives the wood, it's not new. It's giving shape to something that already was there. The wood was already there. So regardless of what the carpenter's intention is in what he's making, I'm not bound by that. I can say, I'm going to take the wood and make it into something else. When God creates the world, we talk about a bria yesh me'ayin, it's something from nothing. He creates the very essence and nature of creation. That's why we start the book, the Torah starts with creation. The purpose of creation is intimately connected with the design of the creator, and it can't be changed. It's like the difference between a carpenter and an artist, for example. An artist that creates art, right? And then someone else goes and copies it, he's called a fraud. He's called a, he's forgery. Maybe it's a forgery. And guess what? If you change the art and you make a different picture, then it's not the original anymore. It's something new, right? Because an artist is creating something new. So if God creates a new world, a world that or creates nature into being, creates something into being from nothing, then so the way we view it is that, and the blueprint of that is the Torah. So the purpose of the Torah is to reveal that inner godly purpose of creation that's intrinsic in its design. That is what the Torah is, as the Medrash puts it. Okay, so what we're trying to take from here is, okay, Torah is not a history book. Torah tells us about our history, but It skips a lot of details. It skips a lot of stories. The Torah is not in any way, shape, or form meant to function as a history book. That's why sometimes it's not in chronological order. The word Torah means Horah. It's meant to guide our life. It's telling us how to live our life. But guess what? It's not just through instruction. Because if it would be just through instruction, then we would start with instruction. We would start with the mitzvahs. The Torah is meant to transform us from within, to mold our character through its teachings, through its stories, right? To be able to find yourself in the Torah, to be able to absorb the teachings of the Torah. Sefer Bereishis, the book of Bereishis, the book of Genesis, is also known as the Sefer Hayashar, the book of the righteous. It's the book of our forefathers and our matriarchs. The purpose is to tell us about these role models from the earliest history and how the principles of Torah can penetrate lives, how they can shape people to our own lives. How Torah can be a Torah Chaim, a living Torah. That's why we start with Bereishis. That's why we start with the story of creation. The Talmudic sages had a discussion. The Medrash relates this discussion, and the question that they came up is that it says, if you have to select a central verse from the Torah that encapsulates the major principle of the Torah, what would be? Which sentence encapsulates the entire Torah? Rabbi Akiva is famous for saying that the most basic, important principle of the Torah is v'ahavta l'reacha kamecha, love your fellow as yourself. One popular view. And there are a couple of others. Ben Azai says, you know what the most important sentence in the Torah, the verse in the Torah, is in our parsha. What does our parsha say? Here's the quote. Let me just share the quote here. Here's the quote. It says, this is the book of the chronicles of man. In the day that God created man, he created him in the likeness of God. This is the most important sentence in the entire Torah, says Ben Azai. Ben Azai says, this is the book of the chronicles of man, is a major principle in the Torah. What's so exciting about this verse? What is this telling us? The verse is telling us, the Torah is telling us, the opening of story of creation is telling us, is that this book shapes the life of man. Why does how can the book of the Torah shape our life? Because he says, because we were created in the image of God. Zeh told us, Adam, that God created us in his own image, in his own likeness. So we also have a soul that's divine in origin. So therefore, Torah's guidance resonates within us. It's not something from the outside trying to influence my life. The Jewish people and Torah are bound up. We're one. Yisrael v'Araisa kulachad, the way the Zohar says it. Israel and the Torah are one. So Torah is much more than just the best self-help book, because the self-help book is coming from the outside. This is our very life itself. And just from a historical perspective, the fact that the relationship that Jewish people have to the Torah, right? The fact that Jewish people are identified today as a nation defies every rule in history. We've lived 2,000 years without a country. We've lived under different cultures. Everything that unites a people of being together is absent by the Jewish people. There's one uniting force, the Torah. This is not a spiritual statement. This is a fact. The very fact of our existence as a Jewish people today can only be pointed out as being connected through Torah. This is our history. This is what makes us a people, makes us a nation. We were created as a people not through having a land. We were created in the desert when we were wandering. By God calling us, saying that you are going to be Mamleches Kohanim, a priestly nation that's bound by the promise of the Torah. So this brings us back to our opening statement. That's why Torah study is not just about learning the laws. It's not just about knowing what to do, what not to do. It's about absorbing the values, the lessons of Torah, which shape who we are, what we are meant to do, how we're meant to live our life, not only through instruction, but through the stories, through the values, through the history that we see in the Torah. So for tonight, I want to focus on what we see, what we can take from how man was created, man and woman, Adam and Eve. And what does that show us? What does that give us? What does that bring to us as far as shaping our identity and our purpose and our mission? Right? So almost all cultures have creation stories, right? That try to answer that question, how did we get here? Our creation story is not so much about to answer how creation happened or how we get here, but what are we here for? It's not the how, it's the why. And I point to every time, whenever discussion comes up with science versus religion, and can they be, can they work together or not? Science is about, it's a different field. Science is about trying to examine how. How are we here? How did we get here? Torah is about why we are here. It's coming from a different vantage point. Now, whether they can come together or not, it's a different discussion. Right? So our creation story is coming not so much to tell us how, but what for. What are we here for? And when we're going to look, we'll look into the story of our creation, we'll see very clearly how when the Torah describes the formation, the creation of mankind, it guides us and instructs us into what we are and what we're meant to be. So let's open up with creation of man on the sixth day of creation, as we said. Let's go here to Bereishis. This is chapter 1 of Genesis, verse 26. Right, by the sixth day, the first part of the day, God creates the living creatures, and then Vayomer Elokim, God says, verse 26, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and they shall rule over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the heaven, and over the animals, and over all the earth, and over all the creeping things that creep onto the earth. And God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Right? Afterward, God blessed them, and that was the end of creation. Because God saw everything that he did. Behold, it was very good. It was evening, it was morning, it was the sixth day. And then we get to Shabbos. Okay, so let's go back to verse 26. There's something very, very strange in this verse that it jumps out at everyone. And it brings up some really, really tough question. God says, let us make man in our image. Who's the us? God had a partner in creation. Who were there two gods here? What are they? Let us make man and create. There's no human being. There was no creation of mankind yet. There was only animals, there were plants. Who was God talking to? Very many commentaries address that question. And there are different answers. One explanation we'll focus on for tonight is that the creation of man is a joint venture between heaven and earth. Okay, so unlike the animal species, which were created in a single step, body and soul were infused as one organic whole. God said, let there be an animal or life, and an animal, a living animal, was created. But the human being was created in two steps. First, body came from the earth, and then a soul was breathed into it. Okay, so let us make man, and here being, let man be a joint venture. It should be us, it should be heaven and earth, it should be a combination of heaven and earth. So on one hand, Adam was made from the most elevated components. The highest level of creation. God says he breathed a soul into his nostrils. All of creation came about through God's speech. Soul of man came through God breathing. He blew. Okay, we know ourselves talking. It takes some energy, but people who can go on and talk for a lot of hours without getting too tired. We all know too well. Try to blow and see how long you can blow for without losing your breath. Blowing comes from deeper within. So as opposed to all other creations which God spoke into being, into existence, when one blows from deep within. The human soul comes from a deep aspect of God's inner being, so to speak. Obviously, God doesn't speak literally and doesn't blow literally. These are all meant to be analogies. So that's part of Adam. That's our soul of the human being. But Adam also consists of the lowest element of creation. Our body was molded from the earth, a lifeless form. So there was a lifeless form. That's even lower than the animals. The animals never were lifeless. The animal was formed as a living being. Right? So God had to breathe life into an inanimate lump of clay, a golem. Two opposite entities. Animals are created as living beings from the first moment of existence. Mankind has heaven and earth. And that is what allows to have, a human being to have two very distinct potential states of consciousness. The soul consciousness gravitates towards godliness, the spiritual light of God. The body is naturally concerned with self. Why did God create mankind in this way, different than all other creations? Because every living thing has soul. Every creation has soul, body and soul. Even inanimate objects have spiritual energy. But all of those creations were created in a way where their spirit and body, the form and matter were combined in one. Mankind, it was separated. Why? Why does man have to be comprised of the highest and the lowest? Because our purpose is to be able to lift up the lowest aspects of creation. You can't lift a pile of bricks without reaching beneath the whole pile. You have to be able to dig deep underneath. So you can't lift up the lowest without having the means of connecting to that level. So when we lift up our own body, which is the lowest being in creation, so we can lift up the entire hierarchy of creation as well, from the bottom up. Right. But what's important to keep hold of is that these two states, body and soul, are not meant to be at odds with each other. It's supposed to work in harmony. The body is meant to be a container for the soul, to allow the soul to transmit that divine light into the physical realm. It's like a light bulb, with its container. The glass around the light bulb is meant to contain that light in order to allow it to shine forth. It's not meant to block it. It's meant to work together. So God created man, as we see here in the very beginning. He formed him from the dust, from the earth, and then he blew into him a living soul, and they're meant to merge together and operate together, where the body allows the soul to shine forth and to lift up the entire creation. But from the very beginning, the body always has the potential to develop a sense of self-importance, a sense of independence. Right? You can look at it. I saw brought an idea, the way it was explained somewhere, that you can look at it like a recessive genetic mutation. Under normal conditions, it's totally unaware. But under certain circumstances, it can come out. It can be the source of a terrible illness, God forbid. And so there's an imperfection in the nature of the body, which was perhaps never meant to be expressed. But under certain circumstances, it can come forward. That flaw was what allowed Adam and Eve to sin. And that then became magnified through sin. Where does this flaw originate from? It originates from the earth itself. In other words, man's body was created from the earth. The earth was created, or the earth during its creation had this flaw that allowed it to, again, to separate, to become independent from the soul, from its source. Where do we see this? The Midrash points out that on the third day of creation, when God created plants, trees, fruit, the trees went independent. The original plan was that the trees will give forth fruit, but that also the tree itself, the bark of the tree, would also have the same flavor as the fruit, would be edible as well. That was the original plan. That the earth should produce fruit trees, and the trees themselves should be fruit as well. And it says, the Midrash says that the trees rebelled. They didn't comply. And the trunk of the fruit-bearing trees remained tasteless, remained inedible. Right? So man is compared to a tree. Right? Adam Eitz Hasada. The man is like a tree of the field. What does that mean? In other words, the purpose of a fruit-bearing tree. The purpose is fruit. The fruit that it gives forth. The tree, the trunk, the branches, those are secondary. That's meant to facilitate the growth in order to get to the purpose. What's the purpose? The purpose is the fruit. Okay? So the trunk is meant to be there to facilitate the purpose, the fruit. But then the trunk goes independent. It says, no, I don't want to be there for the fruit. I want to be there for myself. That's the recessive gene. That's that was embedded within creation of the earth of earth. That it had that ability to say, I'm independent. I'm not there for the fruit. I'm here for myself. So when the earth gave forth trees with non-edible bark, that brought forth an aspect of the trunk that's not in harmony with the fruit. So what we have here, it's very interesting that when we look into the story of creation of man, it's divided into two chapters. We just read the first chapter. Right? The first account of Adam's creation, the focus is on the element of man, of Adam being in the image of God. In other words, the focus is on the dominant model of Adam. Adam, how he is soul, right? The soul, God breathed within him a life of a living soul. That was the model. That was the top-down version. On that level, there's no potential for sin. There's no sin mentioned in the first account, the chapter 1. Man is perfect. We have a body, but the body is meant to reflect our soul in order to allow us to fulfill our purpose of lifting up all of creation. That's the state of consciousness of Adam and Eve pre-sin. Their bodies shone with a spiritual radiance. It says they controlled the animals were in awe of man, not because he did something to happen. It was automatic. It's because they saw the spiritual radiance. Man rules over animals not by force, not by coercion, but because the spirit is apparent in the countenance of man, how he's created in that perfect way. But then we have a second part of the creation story. And we'll see it in a moment, we'll see it inside, in chapter 2. Where all of a sudden we have mankind as being vulnerable, right? Just as the earth translated the program wrongly, in the second stage of development of mankind, there's possibility for error. There's possibility for the body and soul to separate. Right. So when potential is translated into physical reality, all of a sudden there's possibility for a bodily consciousness to be separated from the soul consciousness. There's no perfect harmony anymore between body and soul. Then we have that imperfection. We have that recessive gene that, again, under certain conditions, come out in the forefront. And those conditions happened with the sin of eating of the tree, which we'll get to shortly. Okay, so let's look at the verses inside to compare the two steps of creation. We just read step 1, verse 26, right? God says, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, image of God. They shall rule over the sea, over the fowl, over the heaven, over the animals. And then God blessed them, and he said, be fruitful, multiply the earth, subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea, of the sky, over all the beasts, and tread upon the earth. That was step number 1. Then in chapter 2, I'm going to skip over to the next slide here. Here's chapter 2. Let's take a look at verse 7. Let's go a little higher. Okay, it says, it starts again. These are the generations of the heaven and the earth when they were created, and God created mankind. Okay, Vayitzer Hashem Elokim, God formed man of the dust from the ground. And he breathed into his nostrils a soul of life. Man became a living soul, became a living being. Okay? The first time, in the first verse, we don't talk about a separation between soul and body. Here we talk about body from the earth, soul blown in. In other words, there's a dichotomy, a body and a soul. In the first reading, God created man in his image. The focus is on the soul, which is in the image of God. We don't even mention body. Body is not even mentioned here in the first account of creation. The body is subservient to the soul. In this case, we use the word in verse Vayivra, verse 27, God created man in his image, Vayivra. In the second chapter, it's Vayitzer, he formed him. Formation, it's a potential of being separated from the creator. You're forming something different, something new. So these are two different steps of creation. There's God's original plan, so to speak, the top down, where man is created again. There's soul and body, but the body is meant to reflect the soul. They're meant to be in harmony. But there's always the potential for the body to separate. And that's what we see when creation happened in action, that all of a sudden you have, just like the earth itself rebelled to a certain degree, that when it came into creation itself, the body attained a certain independence. So too with creation of mankind, when it came into action, there's now a certain independence. And all of that sets the stage of understanding the first story of what happens to Adam and Eve. And we see how they were created. Now let's look at what happens. The first thing we're told about Adam and Eve, we're told that he names all the animals. That happens right after creation, right? The whole story, by the way, the tree of knowledge and the serpent, all of that happens within the first 3 hours of creation, all before Shabbos. Man is created just after midday, sometime after midday. And then but before Shabbos, all of this, within 3 hours, all of this happens. There was only a period of 3 hours when everything went wrong, so to speak. Okay, so let's see what happens next. Okay, let's go back into the text and see what happens here in chapter 2. Okay, we said man, he created man, and what's the first thing that happens? He says he creates man from the dust of the ground, and Hashem planted a garden in Eden from the east, and he placed there the man whom he had formed. Hashem caused to sprout from the ground every tree pleasant to see and good to eat, the tree of life in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So we have two different trees here, tree of life and a tree of good and evil, and of the knowledge of good and evil. And then we talk about a river flows out of the Eden to water the garden, and there it separates, it becomes four heads. One of them is Pishon, one of them encompasses all the land. That one's the one who encompasses the land of Chavila. There's gold. Gold of the land is good. There's the crystal and the onyx stone. And the second river is the Gihon. That's the one that encompasses all the land of Cush. The third one is the Tigris. That's the one that flows to the east of Assyria. The fourth river is the Euphrates. Okay, so we have Adam and Eve are settled in the garden just east of Eden, and we have all these rivers that flow out. And then what happens next? Hashem takes the man, he placed him in the Garden of Eden in order to work and guard it. But Hashem commands him, of every tree of the garden you may eat freely, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat of it, for on the day that you eat thereof you shall surely die. Okay, and then we talk about creation of Eve. Well, let's pause here. So the first question is, where is this Garden of Eden? Was this an actual physical place on planet Earth? Okay. It seems from reading the verses, talks about being pleasing to the sight, good to eat. We're talking about something physical, right? There's a river that provides water. There's a geographical locations that are specified. It seems to be a physical location. But the reality is nobody's ever found it. So if there was a physical location, where was it? We talk about Gan Eden, we talk about the afterlife, paradise for the soul, as a spiritual reward. We don't talk about Gan Eden in this physical world. So was it physical or is it spiritual? So here's what the Alshich says. The Alshich was one of the classical commentators, lived in Tzfas in the 16th century, student of the Beit Yosef, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, a great rabbi and a Kabbalist. The Alshich says, gives really a foundation of understanding, of trying to understand where was this place and what was this place where Adam and Eve were placed. Let me see if let me share the quote. I did a rough translation, so hopefully this will come out good. Okay. This is what he says. He says, it seems strange that the Gan Eden contained trees and flowers just like earthly gardens and orchards. For we have a great principle that the reward of a mitzvah is spiritual in nature. So Gan Eden is a spiritual place. Why do we have this physical place? So he says like this, we can understand it this way. Corresponding to this lowly world is a higher world, which serves as its paradigm. This accords with the teachings of the sages of blessed memory that God looked into the Torah and created the world. The medrash we started with. This means that before he created the world, the entire story of creation until the end of the sixth day referred to the supernal world of Atzilut, of emanation. After creation, a likeness of all this that was above was made below. And I'll try to explain in a moment. I just want to read his words. There is no doubt that even though one is created in the image of the other, they are not equal in quality. For the lower world is physical, the higher world ascends above to the ultimate in spirituality. In this same fashion, there is a Gan Eden in this world, and a corresponding to it, one higher than it, and on higher and higher according to the number of worlds. There is no comparison between the spiritual qualities of the lower world with that of the higher world than it, with that of the world higher than it, and so on up to the highest world. Nonetheless, there must remain some resemblance. All the holiness and the lights of the higher world devolve into the lower in a manner that is coarser and more in wrath than above. But the resemblance holds all the way to the bottom, so that it is like a ladder set on earth, whose top reaches higher and higher. So too in this manner, all the lights of the earthly Gan Eden are spiritual in essence, inasmuch as they are in this world, they enwrap themselves with the lowly world and resemble physical trees. So what's the Alshich's answer? In short, the answer is it physical or spiritual? His answer is yes. There was both a physical place called Gan Eden, and there was a spirit, and at the same time, there's a spiritual place called Gan Eden. Both are accurate. Both are right. What does that mean? He says the principle which Kabbalah talks about, Hasidus talks about, that everything that exists in the physical realm has a spiritual source. It originates in a spiritual source. Okay, so when we talk about physical concepts, they have a spiritual counterpart. We can talk about this even within the physical world itself. So, for example, when we talk about sweet. An apple is sweet. Or you can say a person has a sweet character. He's a sweet guy. Using the same word sweet doesn't mean the same thing. This is a tangible sweetness, and there you're talking about character. You say the metal is hard, or this guy is a hard guy. We use certain concepts on a more tangible basis, and they have a more refined way of looking at it. Right? So everything. So when we say is that everything that exists in the physical originates within the spiritual. So when we talk about sweet trees, Gan Eden, and the rivers and everything that flowed forth, that was a physical manifestation of a spiritual reality. So the physical fruit mirrors the sweetness that the soul experiences in the spiritual realm as a result of his exposure to divine light. When a person does a mitzvah, his soul feels the light. When Adam and Eve were created, that was manifested into the physical because there was no schism between body and soul. The body reflected the soul. Because the body reflected the soul, the earth, the physical earth, reflected the spiritual reality as well. Once Adam and Eve sinned, it wasn't Gan Eden they had to leave as a punishment. It was a result of their action. When body became independent from soul, then what happens is the body is no longer a reflection of the soul. So the same happened in the world as well, where there's a certain spiritual reality, but it's not reflected down here anymore. So now in today's day and age, in other words, after the sin, the Garden of Eden is no longer apparent in the physical world anymore. Before the sin, there was a physical place, which was Gan Eden. It was a physical location that's outlined in the text, and the physical trees and the fruit were transparent to it, the spiritual garden. Nachmanides says that for this reason, the Garden of Eden did not require any work. Okay. The Nachmanides says, when he talks about the Garden of Eden, he says these trees didn't need anyone to tend, to prune. Hashem Elokim planted, God planted. It all happened on its own. This is the works of Hashem's hands. Now, why does God tell Adam and Eve to work? Or why did he tell Adam to work and guard the garden? We're not talking about planting. Working means to attend to the spiritual health of the garden, to enhance the garden by working, by eating that which was permitted, and by guarding from refraining from that which was forbidden. Here's how the Orach Chaim puts it. Another classical commentator from the 18th, early 18th century, famous Moroccan rabbi, Kabbalist, who writes as follows. See if I can share the quote here from the Orach Chaim. He says, in those days prior to the sin, when Hashem placed man in the Garden of Eden, man could see the effect on life in the Garden of Eden through his actions. However, after his expulsion, while his actions continued to cultivate the spiritual garden, he was prevented from seeing its effect. This is what the rabbis were speaking of when they said to work it. These are the positive mitzvahs, to guard it. These are the negative mitzvahs. In other words, the command to Adam and Eve to work and guard the garden were given to every single person. We also are commanded to work and guard the garden. Work means the positive mitzvahs. Guard means refrain from the negative mitzvahs. When we work, when we do the positive mitzvahs, we're creating a beautiful spiritual garden. And when we guard from doing negative mitzvahs, we're enhancing that garden. But we don't see how it's reflected in a physical realm, because right now there's a schism between the spirit and the physical. By Adam and Eve, when they were in the garden, everything that existed in the spiritual came down to a physical location. So today, after post-sin, Garden of Eden is not confined to a limited space anymore. It's still spiritually accessible. And then our soul, after life, its reward, so to speak, is that paradise, that Gan Eden. So that's the definition of Gan Eden. Okay, but so now that's where Adam and Eve were put. And the first instruction that they were given is that there were two trees. There was a tree of life, and there was a tree of knowledge of good and evil. The tree of life they were allowed to taste of, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil they were meant to stay away from. And here is where everything started unraveling. Okay, so before we get into what this tree, let's start with the basics. What kind of tree was this? The Torah doesn't tell us. They ask anyone on the street, what was the tree that the serpent gave Eve to eat from? What kind of tree was it? Chances are they'll tell you it was an apple tree. But where do they take that from? Let's go back to the verse. Does the Torah say anywhere that it's an apple tree? It doesn't say anywhere apple tree. And if we go back into the verse, he talks about there was a nice a tree of life, tree of knowledge of good and evil, and he tells them this tree you should eat, this tree you shouldn't eat. Doesn't say what kind of fruit at all. Doesn't say what type of tree it was. Where did the apple tree myth? And I say it's a myth because there's no Jewish source whatsoever for this tree to have the identity of an apple tree. Where does this myth come from? Right, and I'll point out that there's actually the Medrash says that there's a reason why God not to tell us what tree it was. We'll get that in a minute. It says, but where does the myth of apple tree come from? So I saw there was a couple of interesting theories out there. I don't think there's any known reason, but one interesting theory that I think resonates is that in Latin, not that I'm a big Latin expert, but in Latin there's a word called malum. Okay, and malum is a noun that can mean evil, and it also means apple. Okay, so people associated these words, right? They assumed that by eating the malum, by eating the apple, Adam and Eve came into contact with malum, with evil. Okay, so we talk about Adam's apple. All of this stems from the Apple and Eve is a big apple juice company. All of this is a myth that has no source in any Jewish sources whatsoever. What do Jewish sources say as far as origin? Again, the Torah itself, we see clearly does not mention any identity to this fruit. The Talmud does bring three opinions as to what type of fruit this was. It can never be undisputed. So there are three different opinions in the Talmud to what type of tree this was. And in fact, one of the opinions it wasn't really a tree. It says it was a wheat stalk. I guess they were very tall wheat stalks, according to one opinion in the Talmud. Another opinion in the Talmud says that it was a fig tree. And the proof that he comes up with is that when Adam and Eve realized that they were naked, what did they do? And they became embarrassed, they became ashamed. They covered their bodies with fig leaves. Why fig leaves? Because that was the leaves that they were standing in the midst of. That's that opinion in the Talmud. There's another opinion in the Talmud that it was a grapevine. Because all biblical stories where the early generations got in trouble was always with grapes. Noah got in trouble when he got drunk. Lot got in trouble when he got drunk. So therefore he says it was probably a grape tree. And according to that opinion, he says that it was forbidden to eat from this tree of knowledge only during those few hours up until Shabbos. On Shabbos, Adam was meant to make Kiddush on grape juice. He just had to wait until Shabbos. That's according to that opinion. The Medrash, a different Medrash brings and says that it was actually an esrog tree coming from the holiday of Sukkot. So these are different, various opinions as far as what the identity of the fruit was. But you know what? The Torah actually, for a reason, the Medrash says that there's a reason why the Torah doesn't tell us. The Torah says, Rabbi Azariah says that heaven forbid, chas v'shalom, God never revealed the identity of the tree to any man, and he never will. Out of concern to the dignity of Adam and Eve. They don't want us to be reminded of their sin every time we encounter that type of tree. The Torah is even concerned for the dignity of the tree itself, that it shouldn't be associated with Adam and Eve's sin. So the Torah specifically doesn't tell. There's certain stories in the Torah where the Torah it tells us about every detail, and there's a reason for that one. Next week, when we're going to learn about the ark, we're going to see a tremendous amount of detail into the building of the ark and its dimensions and what materials were used. But every story has its reasons. And in this case, the identity of the fruit was specifically and purposefully omitted. But it definitely wasn't an apple. That we're all clear about. Okay. So what happened with this tree? All right. So that's obviously a big discussion, but just as a continuation of our understanding of creation of man, of soul and body, and that how originally soul and body were transparent to each other. What was the tree? The tree of knowledge of good and evil wasn't an evil tree. Okay? The tree itself is the essence of life. Life from life from God. We can't have evil. We can't have. There's no evil. It doesn't say that this tree was evil. Okay? But what he does say is that the tree itself was the knowledge of good and evil. Knowledge doesn't mean information. In biblical terminology, chachma, bina, das. Chachma and bina is the information. Das, knowledge, means our connection to the information. Okay, so for example, you have a child and you tell him that deep water is dangerous. You can explain it to him, but the child doesn't hesitate. He goes into the deep water, okay, and then he starts drowning, God forbid, and you schlep him out. Now he has the knowledge. Now he knows that deep water is dangerous. Before he maybe had the information, but now he's connected to that information. So knowledge changes us. Knowledge is not distinct from us. Knowledge, because it has an impact on us, where the information now impacts me. It changes who I am. So up until Adam and Eve got involved with this tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, evil existed as a potential state. The creation of evil was a possibility. It's there. The information was there, but there was no connection to it. It didn't impact Adam and Eve. It was a distinct reality. They had no knowledge of evil. They had no desire for evil. Evil existed, but it was outside of their world. It was outside of human consciousness. Once man ate from the fruit of this tree, knowledge and sensation were added to their to human psyche. Right now, there's a tug of good versus evil. There's impulses pulling us separate ways. Now, all of a sudden, body is pulling this way and soul is pulling that way. That's the precursor that allows evil to develop. The way the Rambam Maimonides uses different terminology in Moreh Nevuchim, in his Guide to Perplex, he uses the terminology he uses is interesting. He says, prior to the sin, man did not classify experience as good or evil. There was truth and falsehood. Truth and falsehood are nouns. Right? They're objective absolutes. It's factual ideas that exist. This is truth, this is false. It has nothing to do with my personal experience. Good and evil are adjectives. They're relative terms that are identified with how it reflects, what my self-reflection is. So good and evil happens in a world where there is knowledge, right? Where the qualities are now experienced. There's knowledge of them. It becomes part of me. Up until that act, there was truth and false. Objective facts. Now all of a sudden it becomes a struggle of good and evil. That's how the Rambam puts it. That's how Maimonides puts it. Right? So the primary consequence of what happens once this eating of the forbidden fruit, in other words, God says, don't get involved. This is not, This is knowledge. This is going to change you. It's going to impact you. See, from God's perspective, nothing exists outside of him. So the knowledge doesn't change him. By God knowing doesn't change him because everything's within him. But by mankind, not me and the thing that I know are separate. There's me, and then there's this information. And now this information becomes part of me and changes me. Like now, all of a sudden, maybe the child is scared to go swimming because he's scared he's going to drown. Until then, he's never had the fear. What caused the fear? The knowledge changed him. It says, once you get involved in this knowledge is going to change you, Adam and Eve. Evil is going to become something that you're going to grapple with now. It's not just some outside concept. It's part of your reality. So that's dangerous. So stay away from it. And once they got involved with that, that creates the wedge between body and soul. Sensation arouses the ego. The ego, all of a sudden, the interests of the individual, my own self-independence, the body wants its thing, the soul wants its thing, and that's where that schism between body and soul happens, and that creates a schism in the world between the spiritual and the material, between good and between evil, and there's now a constant struggle in the world. And you can say, in a sense, that wasn't the original plan, but in a sense, it was the plan, because God really orchestrated this too. And why does he do that? That we'll leave for perhaps next week when we talk about Noach and the flood, the consequences, what happened after the sin of Adam and Eve, because the sin of Adam and Eve set into motion the rest of the parsha, where man now begins to become corrupt. We have Cain and Hevel, there's conflict, there's murder, and then all of a sudden, man gets further and further from the original purpose. The original purpose was that man is meant to uplift all of creation, and instead we go further and further away. But the first act is this act that takes place with the tree of knowledge, the tree of knowledge between good and evil. Okay, so we'll stop here for tonight. Next week we'll try to continue the conversation in the events of later on in this parsha, going into next parsha. And as I started with in the beginning, again we're starting a new cycle of learning, so it's a great opportunity to invite a friend, invite someone else to join. Let's expand our circle of learning, and let's make it a year of learning for all of us. So wish everyone a good Shabbos. God willing, we'll be back next week, Thursday night, with the next Torah studies class. We also have a JLI course upcoming, which will you can see information on our site. We'll talk about it as we move along. So we'll open it up for questions and answers. Wish everyone a good Shabbos. Glad to be back learning again Torah. Yes, John.
Yes. After your sermon on Yom Kippur, I read Joshua, trying to find the wedding you mentioned between Joshua and the reformed Zonah.
Right.
I couldn't.